This may be a ramble of thoughts, but after I recently stumbled upon this sub, I finally felt I had found a place where I could share something my family and I experienced a few years ago. To this day, it still gives me a shiver. I've been camping, solo backpacking, and hunting my whole life in Oregon. I feel comfortable in the woods and have a deep respect for nature. A few years ago, my wife, daughter, and 2 German shepherds went camping north of Mount Jefferson in Oregon. I've included the coordinates of our campsite, which we found to be the perfect setup for us and our 2 dogs. Privacy was important because they can intimidate other dog owners and get loud when spooked. It wasn't an established campsite, just a horseshoe off a USFS road with flat ground, full trees, and a fire pit. The first night, my daughter wanted to sleep by herself in a 2-man tent right next to ours. It was maybe 2 feet away from me and my wife's tent. We had our male German Shepherd, Gus, sleep with her in her tent. That whole first night, neither my wife nor I could sleep. We both heard heavy footsteps, not like the typical forest critters scampering around at night. I was well armed because I had recently read about a dad in California who was shot and killed in a tent next to his 2 infant daughters. Needless to say, both my wife and I had pistols, and I also had my rifle with me. Dogs are great at detection, which is why I felt my daughter could sleep alone. Gus is completely fearless, and nothing would lay a hand on her without a battle to the death. All in all, nothing but bad vibes and loud footsteps occurred that night, which I ultimately decided were caused by a deer or maybe some elk. Day 2. We went for a walk around the road maybe 300 feet away from the circle area in the photo. I saw an abandoned road where a rusted gate post was covered in vegetation. Something blue caught my eye, and Gus immediately took off running down the road. My heart began to race because I thought it was another family camping like us, and I was worried Gus would get himself shot or scare someone to death. I chased after him as fast as I could, and the rest of the family followed. He stopped after 20 feet, but I had already covered enough distance to see that there was nobody there, and something felt off about the sight. I yelled, "Hello? Is anyone here? Sorry about the dog," but got no response. Curiosity got the best of me, and I had to see what the sight actually was. As I got closer, I knew something was wrong. It had all the necessities for a campsite: a cooler, propane burner, tent, blankets, folding table. But every single item had been completely destroyed, smashed, or torn with what appeared to be claw marks. We all walked around, puzzled as to why anyone would leave their camping gear behind, including an expensive REI tent. I figured someone left in a hurry, and animals got to the rest. That seemed like the only logical explanation. But a flattened propane tank and cooler? That certainly wasn't caused by animals or snowpack in that tree-covered spot. Later that afternoon, while my daughter and I played bocce ball at the campsite, my wife walked about 70 feet north to do her business. I didn't have a direct line of sight, but suddenly I saw Gus make a mad dash toward her. Normally, he would stay with me unless called over, and she hadn't called him. His speed and focus caught my attention. I knew something weird was happening, so I ran over. My wife started jogging back toward me, and I immediately drew my pistol. Gus had continued running into the forest another 100 feet before stopping when I called him. Meanwhile, our other dog, Leah, who never misses the opportunity to lead, stayed glued to my daughter's side. I've had her for 7 years, and this was the first time in her life she refused to leave my daughter. Her hair was fully raised, and she was attached to us at the hip. When I asked my wife what happened, she said, "I was trying to pee, and all of a sudden I felt the hairs on my neck raise. I knew someone was watching. Then I saw Gus running toward me, so I got up and started moving back to you." We spent 10 minutes searching for signs of anything, trails, broken branches, or anything unusual, but found nothing. Final night. We decided to stay one more night since it was too late to pack up and drive, but we all slept in the big tent together. Before bed, I set up a makeshift perimeter alarm using a rope, a mint can, coins, and keys from our truck. It wasn't sophisticated, but it put my wife at ease. While tying the last corner to a tree, I noticed a third mystery. Someone had done the exact same thing years ago. There was an old, broken rope with rusted washers tied to the same tree, about 8 to 10 inches off the ground. It looked like it had been there for 10 to 15 years. That night, I fired a clip from my .45 into the dirt to signal to anything out there that we were armed. It was quiet that night, no footsteps, and the dogs didn't bark. Fast forward to today. I recently watched Missing 411 Hunted on Amazon and noticed a cluster of disappearances close to where we camped. A flood of dread hit me as I thought about that mysterious abandoned campsite with its ripped-up tent and smashed cooler. We've continued camping and enjoying the beauty of the Northwest, but I often think about that weekend. I thank my lucky stars Gus was there to do his thing so well that afternoon. I've always found peace in working with my hands. There's something grounding about shaping raw wood into something useful and beautiful. Over the years, I've made furniture, repaired old barns, and restored cabins for clients who wanted a slice of rural nostalgia. But this time, it was different. I wasn't building for someone else. I was building for myself. It was 2018 when I bought the plot of land. It sat at the edge of a sprawling forest in northern Michigan, about 30 miles from the nearest town. No neighbors, no traffic, just miles of trees and the occasional deer. The property came cheap, mostly because of its isolation. That was fine by me. I needed a place to clear my head, escape the noise of the world, and pour myself into a project that mattered. The plan was simple: build a one-room cabin where I could work and live for a while. I'd make the furniture myself, tables, chairs, a bed frame, using wood from the forest around me. I figured it would take a few months of hard work, but I wasn't in a rush. The idea of being alone out there didn't bother me. If anything, it felt like a gift. I started the project in early April. The snow had just melted, and the ground was soft but workable. I parked my truck at the edge of the property, unloaded my tools, and set up a small tent where I'd sleep until the cabin was livable. The first week was spent clearing the site. I cut down a few trees, careful to select only what I needed, and stripped the bark to prepare the logs for the cabin walls. The work was exhausting, but satisfying. By the end of each day, my arms ached and my clothes were soaked with sweat and sawdust. The woods around me were quiet but not silent. During the day, I'd hear birds chirping, the rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, and the occasional creak of trees swaying in the wind. At night, the sounds changed. Frogs croaked from a nearby creek, and coyotes howled in the distance. Sometimes I'd hear something larger moving through the forest. Probably a deer, I told myself, but it always made my heart race. I wasn't scared exactly, but being out there alone, so far from anyone, made me hyper-aware of every noise. By the second week, I had the foundation laid and was starting to stack the logs for the walls. I worked from dawn until dusk, stopping only to eat and rest my sore muscles. The routine was comforting, but the isolation was starting to weigh on me. I caught myself talking out loud, narrating what I was doing, just to hear a voice. It felt silly, but it helped. One evening, as I was packing up my tools, I noticed something strange. A tree near the edge of the clearing had a fresh gash in the bark about 5 feet off the ground. It looked like someone had struck it with a hatchet, but the cut was jagged as if done in a hurry. I hadn't been working in that area and I hadn't seen anyone else on the property. I told myself it must have been an animal, a bear, maybe, but the thought unsettled me. The next day I found more marks. 3 trees, all within a few hundred yards of the cabin site, had similar gashes. They were too high up to be from deer and too deep to be from claws. I couldn't make sense of it. I kept working, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few nights later, I woke up to a noise outside my tent. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone dragging a stick across the ground. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The moon was bright enough to see the clearing, but nothing looked out of place. The sound had stopped. The next morning, I found a line of footprints in the dirt leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin site. They were large, barefoot, and definitely human. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing. Whoever had made them had walked right past my tent, only a few feet away from where I'd been sleeping. I decided to take precautions. I started keeping my tools inside the tent at night in case I needed to defend myself. I also set up a crude alarm system using fishing line and empty cans, stringing it around the perimeter of my camp. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. The next few days were uneventful. I focused on building, trying to keep my mind occupied. The cabin walls were nearly complete, and I was starting to work on the roof, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees or a branch swaying when there was no wind. I'd stop what I was doing and scan the forest, but I never saw anything. One afternoon, I decided to take a break and explore the property. I followed the creek for a while, enjoying the sound of the water and the smell of wet earth. About half a mile from the cabin site, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. It was a small clearing, and in the center was a pile of animal bones. They looked like they'd been there for a while, bleached white by the sun, but the arrangement was deliberate. They were stacked in a crude pyramid, with a deer skull balanced on top. I backed away slowly, my skin crawling. It felt like a warning, though I couldn't say from what. I hurried back to the cabin site, my eyes scanning the forest the whole way. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside the tent made me jump. At one point, the cans I'd strung up clattered together, and I bolted upright, clutching a hammer. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to finish the cabin as quickly as possible, then leave. I didn't care how much work I'd put into it or how much money I'd spent. Something wasn't right about this place, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I worked like a man possessed, putting in 14-hour days to get the roof on and the door installed. By the end of the week, the cabin was done. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps between the logs, and the roof leaked in places, but it was enough. On my last night, I sat by the fire, staring at the cabin. It should have felt like an accomplishment, but all I felt was dread. The woods were too quiet, as if they were holding their breath. I packed my things and decided to sleep in the truck. I wanted to be ready to leave at first light. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something heavy hitting the side of the truck. I sat up, my heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. The windows were fogged up from my breath, so I couldn't see outside. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The next sound was unmistakable, the slow, deliberate creak of the cabin door opening. I didn't wait to see who or what had gone inside. I started the truck and drove away, the tires spinning in the dirt. In my rearview mirror, I saw the cabin, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. I never went back. Let me know if you'd like any further refinements. I remember it like it just happened. In the summer of 1931, I made the choice to go camping by myself for a few nights in the woods outside a small town. I wanted to get away for a while. No noise, no people, just me and the quiet of the woods. I packed my old tent, some food, a lantern, and my knife. The spot I picked seemed perfect. There were tall trees everywhere and a small stream nearby. I set up my camp in a little clearing that felt safe. It was far enough from town that no one would bother me, but not too deep into the woods. It felt right. The first night was calm. I could hear the usual sounds. Crickets, the stream flowing softly, and now and then a noise from a small animal in the bushes. I sat by the fire until it got dark, then crawled into my tent and fell asleep without much trouble. But the second night was different. I can't really explain it, but something felt wrong. When the sun started going down, I noticed how quiet the woods had become. There weren't as many sounds, no crickets, no movement in the bushes, just stillness. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just overthinking, but as I sat by the fire that night, the feeling of being alone started to change. I hadn't seen another person for miles, but it suddenly felt like I wasn't by myself. I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I could sense eyes on me, watching from somewhere in the trees. I stayed up longer than I wanted to, just listening. Nothing really happened, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Eventually, I forced myself to go into the tent, telling myself I was being paranoid. On the third day, I woke up early, planning to explore around a bit. I stuck to the trails I knew, staying close enough to my campsite so I wouldn't get lost. But on the way back, I noticed something strange. The path I had walked the day before looked different. There were broken branches, and the ground looked disturbed, like someone or something had come through there. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but as I walked, I saw something that made me stop. In the dirt were footprints, large ones. They were too big to be mine, and they weren't shaped like any animal prints I'd seen. A cold feeling hit me. I hurried back to camp, and when I got there, my heart skipped a beat. The fire I had put out the night before had been messed with, like someone had tried to stir it up, and some of my food was gone. I stood there for a minute, trying to figure it out. I hadn't seen or heard anyone around. It didn't make sense. Who would come all the way out here, touch my stuff, and leave without me noticing? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside the tent made me jump. I could hear twigs snapping and soft footsteps just beyond the light of my fire. I lay there, holding my knife, trying not to breathe too loudly. I wanted to believe I was just imagining it, but the noises wouldn't stop. I felt trapped in my tent, too scared to look outside, but too scared to stay in. After hours of this, I finally peeked out of the tent. The fire had burned down to just a few glowing embers, but there was enough light to see the edge of the clearing. And there, at the tree line, I saw someone standing. They were just standing there, perfectly still, watching me. I froze. I hoped they hadn't seen me move. I couldn't make out much in the darkness, but I could tell it was a tall person. They didn't move closer, didn't leave, just stood there, staring in my direction. I spent the entire night like that, holding my knife and waiting for them to do something. But they didn't. When the sun finally began to rise, I looked out again. They were gone, as if they had never been there at all. I didn't waste time. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up my things and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't even check if I left anything behind. I just needed to get away. I don't know who or what was out there in those woods, but I never went back to that spot. Maybe it was just a wanderer, or maybe someone had been watching me from the moment I set up camp. I'll never know. But every now and then, even now, I get that same feeling again, the cold, creeping sense that someone is just out of sight, watching, and I wonder if they ever really left, or if they're still out there, waiting for the right moment to step closer. I was part of a small army unit stationed at a remote training camp deep in the woods. We were out there for a week-long survival exercise meant to push us to our limits. Our camp was surrounded by thick trees and dense brush, with only a few makeshift tents and a small fire pit to keep us warm at night. The first few days were normal: training drills, navigational tasks, and the usual camaraderie that comes with roughing it. But on the fourth night, something started to feel off. I was on night watch alone while the others slept. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I heard a faint noise, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon. I scanned the dark forest, but all I could see were shadows shifting in the moonlight. I tried to shake off the unease and focus on my duty. The noise grew louder and closer. I gripped my flashlight tighter, trying to cut through the darkness with its beam. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and an eerie silence settled over the camp. My heart pounded. I knew something wasn't right. I moved cautiously towards the noise, trying to stay as quiet as I could. As I got closer to the edge of the camp, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, barely visible, was crouched behind a tree. It looked like a man, but I couldn't make out any details. I froze, unsure if I should move forward or pull back. I decided to back away slowly, hoping to alert the others without making any sudden moves. I turned my head briefly to check on the camp, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I was about to let out a sigh of relief when I saw a pair of fresh boot prints in the dirt, large, military-style prints that didn't match any of ours. I rushed back to wake the others. We packed up our gear quickly, staying alert for any signs of danger. The unsettling feeling didn't go away as we hurried to dismantle our camp and load our gear. Just before dawn, we drove away from that remote, eerie forest. When we finally got back to base, we learned there had been a recent escape from a nearby maximum security prison. The description of the escape matched the figure I had seen. We had unknowingly crossed paths with a dangerous fugitive that night in the woods. We narrowly avoided a deadly encounter. How close we had come to a real nightmare is something that still sends chills down my spine. A few months ago, I was out hiking with my partner. We live in the mountains of western Maryland, and we were about 6 miles into an 8-mile loop we've done frequently when we decided to take some pictures and have a snack at the summit. This area of the trail had park benches, tables, and a parking lot. We were sitting and talking when I noticed a man walking around the parking lot alone. He was walking aimlessly and staring at his feet. What confused me was that he was in jeans and a button-down shirt, not exactly hiking attire. We decided to set off on the last 2-mile leg of the loop. This part of the trail goes down the hill to the park headquarters, which is cut out of the mountainside. At the end of that leg is the parking lot where our car is. You don't have much visibility from the trail, and you have to walk single file. I was walking in front, talking to my friend. I turned to look at her and saw the same man right behind her, following at an unnervingly close distance. I immediately got a gut-wrenching feeling. I noticed he didn't have a pack or any hiking gear and wasn't even wearing boots. Something about his eyes really spooked me. A bit more walking, and he continued to follow very closely. I said to my friend that I needed to tie my shoe as a reason to step off the trail and let him pass us, just in case he was following closely because he wanted to go faster than we were. She immediately caught on to what I was doing, and we pulled over. He looked startled, said hello politely, and then just stared. This is when I noticed he was carrying a stick. As I was fiddling with my shoe, when she stood between us, he passed by. We waited to give him some distance ahead of us, and he immediately slowed down. We waited a bit longer, and he got farther up the trail before he turned around and began just looking up at us. We decided that something felt way too wrong about this guy, and we didn't want to have to pass him again. So, we turned around and walked back up to the trail toward the park, where the tables and parking lot were. A few minutes into walking up the trail, I looked back to see him walking up the trail too. He was now following us again. I told my friend to walk faster. We hurried up the trail and got to the parking area where we had started. We began to strategize and wait, deciding we would wait to see if he came back up the trail. There were people around here, so we felt a lot safer waiting it out. About 20 minutes went by, and nothing happened. We were talking about how that could mean he kept going on the trail, and is long gone, or is waiting on the trail where it's more deserted. We saw a couple come up from the trail we were on, presumably taking the loop in the opposite direction we had. We approached them and asked if they saw anyone on the trail between this lot. Next, they told us they saw a young man sitting on a rock about halfway down. They proceeded to describe the man who was indeed following us. We explained our interaction to them, and soon we got into a conversation about whether or not he was an actual threat. The husband finally interjected and said, "We need to call a ranger." He wasn't just sitting there, he had a knife and was carving a stick. Needless to say, we called the ranger. The nice couple walked the last leg with us to make sure we got to our car safely and gave us their numbers in case we needed anything. The rangers then walked the trail, but there was no sight of him. I wish I knew where he went and what happened to him, but I'm glad to know that my instincts are legitimate. So creepy knife-carrying man in the woods, let's not meet again. I wasn't sure where to post this, but after all these years, this whole event still feels paranormal. I don't know what to make of it, so I'm sharing it here for any perspective or feedback. When I was 9 months old, my dad drowned in a freak accident. He was helping friends loosen a canoe that had gotten stuck in the river. The undertow snagged him, and no one ever saw him alive again. They found him a few days later, a couple of miles down the river. 20 years later, I am camping with my girlfriend, my best bro, and his girlfriend. It was a beautiful summer night, packed in the northwest, and it was about 9:30 p.m., mostly dark. My bro and I hiked a short trip to this rock overhang that had a perfect view of the river. We lit some cigarettes, sipped on a beer, and chatted. 2 minutes in, this happened. Across the riverbank, I see my dad standing there, staring at me. I don't remember knowing him, but I do have an image of him in my mind from pictures. He looked exactly like my dad did at the time he died. I nudged my friend and asked him if he was seeing the same thing, but he didn't. Then, a sort of spotlight blasted my dad, and he immediately broke the stare and walked to his left, about 20 feet down the river as well as a little back into the trees. He started pulling some tools and a rope out of a cash bag. At this point, I am pale and shaking. My friend, worried because I'm staring into the dark and not responding, asked me what I'm seeing. But wow, what was I seeing? The whole other side of the riverbank was now like a stage lit up, and my dad was working on something with his back to me. He finally turned around, and he had a noose in his hands. He threw it over a tree branch and proceeded to slip it around his neck, saying absolutely nothing. Then he hung himself to death while staring at me. We had other odd experiences for the rest of the night, but nothing like that. I'm now 41, and I still haven't integrated this experience. It really messed me up, and I can't help but wonder, did he really drown, or is that what I was told? I've had numerous close calls with suicide as a young adult, but never by hanging. Was my dad telling me a hidden truth, or was that somebody else entirely? It's definitely been a strange one. It was early October 2021, and my job had sent me to a border town in northern Montana. I worked for a construction supply company, and this particular trip was to finalize a deal with a local contractor building cabins along the US-Canada border. I wasn't thrilled about it. The weather had turned cold, the drive was long, and the area was so remote that cell service was spotty at best. Still, work was work, and I couldn't say no. The contractor, a guy named Lewis, had a reputation for being difficult. The company told me he was picky about details and always wanted to meet in person, no matter how far away it was. That's why I was driving up to this cabin, his latest project, on a 2-lane road that snaked through dense forests and past lonely fields. There wasn't much around, just the occasional ranch or hunting cabin, most of them looking empty for the season. After 4 hours of driving, I finally arrived at the coordinates Lewis had sent me. It wasn't a construction site like I'd imagined, but a small ranger cabin tucked into the woods. The place looked like it had been around for decades. The wood was weathered, and the windows streaked with dirt. A faded U.S. Forest Service sign hung crookedly over the door. It didn't look like anyone had used it in years. There was no car outside, and the place seemed abandoned. I double-checked the address, then stepped out of my rental car. My boots crunched on the gravel driveway. The air was colder than I expected, and the wind whipped through the trees, making a low, hollow sound. I knocked on the cabin door, but there was no answer. I tried again, louder this time, but still, nothing. Feeling uneasy, I walked around the cabin. The back was overgrown with weeds, and there was an old woodpile stacked haphazardly near the rear wall. A rusted axe was stuck in a stump nearby, its handle splitting from age. I peeked through one of the windows, but the glass was so grimy I could barely see inside. What little I could make out didn't look promising. Just a single room with a table, a chair, and a wood stove in the corner. I was starting to think I'd been sent on a wild goose chase when I heard something in the woods. It wasn't loud, just a faint crack of a branch snapping, but it was enough to make me freeze. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but I didn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched crept over me, and I couldn't shake it. I decided to wait in the car. Maybe Lewis had been delayed or had given me the wrong time. I locked the doors, turned the engine on to keep warm, but the isolation was getting to me. The forest around me seemed alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional gust of wind. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but it was always just shadows. After about an hour, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out and knocked on the cabin door again, harder this time. To my surprise, the door creaked open under my fist. It wasn't locked. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was just as run down as I'd imagined. The air was musty, and a layer of dust covered everything. There was no sign of Lewis or anyone else, for that matter. The table was empty, except for a few faded papers, and the wood stove looked like it hadn't been used in years. A single cot was pushed against the far wall, its mattress stained and sagging. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. The papers on the table weren't old forestry documents, like I'd assumed. They were hand-drawn maps, detailed and precise, showing the area around the cabin. Some of the maps had red X's marked on them, and others had notes scribbled in the margins. One map in particular caught my eye. It showed a section of forest about a mile from the cabin, with a large circle drawn around it, and the words "Do not enter" written in bold letters. A chill ran down my spine. Who had made these maps, and why? I folded the one with the warning and slipped it into my pocket. Something about the place didn't feel right, and I wanted to get out of there. As I turned to leave, I noticed fresh footprints on the dusty floor, prints that hadn't been there when I came in. They were large, like a man's boots, and they led from the door to the cot. But there was no one else in the cabin. Panic set in, and I bolted outside. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. It was just a fleeting shadow, but it looked like a person standing in the cabin doorway, watching me leave. I drove back to town as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a motel on the edge of town. I checked in, locked the door, and pulled out the map. The circled area wasn't far from the cabin, but I had no intention of going back to check it out. I didn't know what I'd stumbled into, but it was clear that someone or something didn't want me there. The next day, I called my boss and told him I couldn't reach Lewis. I didn't mention the cabin or the maps. I just said the meeting fell through and left it at that. But even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about that place. The maps, the footprints, and the shadow in the doorway. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't natural, and I have a feeling it's still there, watching, waiting for anyone foolish enough to get too close. It was the fall of 2016 when my sister, her husband Ethan, and I decided to spend a weekend at his family's old cabin. Ethan had inherited the place from his grandmother, who had passed away a few years ago. It sat deep in the woods of northern Michigan, far from any main roads, tucked away from civilization. I had never been there before, but Ethan swore it was the perfect place to relax and unplug. The drive up took us nearly 6 hours. As we got closer, the landscape changed. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt, and eventually we were driving through thick, towering trees. The woods felt endless, the kind of place where you could easily get lost. The cabin finally came into view, sitting in a small clearing. It was old, made of weathered logs that had turned gray over time. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the windows looked foggy from years of neglect. Ethan parked the truck, and we climbed out. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the earthy smell of leaves and damp wood. My sister shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her, while Ethan seemed unbothered as he grabbed our bags from the truck bed and carried them to the front porch. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Just one main room with a kitchenette, a fireplace, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft with 2 mattresses. There was no electricity, only an old propane lantern, and no running water aside from a hand pump near the sink. The bathroom was an outhouse about 50 feet away from the cabin. Rustic didn't even begin to describe it. We spent the first few hours settling in. Ethan showed us where the firewood was stacked and how to use the old wood-burning stove. By the time we had a fire going, the sun was setting, and the woods outside were quickly swallowed by darkness. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The loft was drafty, and every creak of the cabin or rustle of the trees outside seemed amplified. My sister and Ethan were asleep on the other mattress, but I lay awake, staring at the slanted ceiling. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I heard a noise. It wasn't the wind or the groan of old wood. It was a deliberate sound, like footsteps on the porch. My heart started racing, and I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped, followed by a faint scraping sound, like metal against wood. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then the scraping sound came again, louder this time, and I couldn't convince myself anymore. I wanted to wake Ethan, but I didn't want to make a fool of myself if it turned out to be nothing. The noise stopped after a few minutes, and I eventually fell into a restless sleep. When we stepped outside the next morning, I noticed something strange. The wooden steps leading up to the porch had deep gouges in them, like someone had dragged something heavy and sharp across the wood. Ethan shrugged it off, saying it was probably from years of wear and tear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. We spent the day hiking the trails near the cabin. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, but there was an oppressive silence to them, like the trees absorbed all sound. Even the birds seemed quieter here. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. We made dinner on the propane stove, and Ethan told stories about his grandmother. He said she used to spend weeks at a time there, even during the winter when the snow was so deep you couldn't drive in. As the fire crackled in the hearth, I felt myself starting to relax. Maybe I had let my imagination get the better of me the night before. But that night, the noises started again. It began with the same footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Then came the scraping, this time on the side of the cabin near the kitchen window. I lay frozen in the loft, staring at the dark outline of the window above me. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I heard something bump against the front door, followed by the unmistakable sound of the doorknob rattling. My throat went dry, and I felt my chest tighten. Someone or something was trying to get inside. I reached over and shook Ethan awake. He groggily sat up, but the noises had stopped by the time he was fully awake. He climbed down the ladder to check the door, but it was locked and nothing seemed out of place. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, we found tracks in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, almost like boot prints, but uneven, as if whoever made them was dragging one foot. The gouges on the porch steps were deeper now, and the door frame had fresh scratches on it. Ethan looked worried, but tried to downplay it. He said it was probably a hunter passing through, maybe someone who got lost. I didn't believe him. Whoever it was had been there for 2 nights in a row. We decided to stay one more night. Ethan didn't want to cut the trip short, and my sister trusted him. I didn't want to be the paranoid one, so I went along with it. That day we stuck close to the cabin. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone watching us, but the woods were still and quiet. When night fell, Ethan locked the door and barricaded it with a heavy chair. He kept his hunting rifle close by, just in case. I barely slept, lying awake in the loft and listening for any sound for hours. It was silent. Then, sometime after midnight, the noises started again. This time, they were louder. The footsteps were heavier, and the scraping sounded more aggressive. Whatever it was circling the cabin, stopping every few minutes to rattle the windows or the door. Ethan grabbed his rifle and sat by the door, waiting. My sister stayed close to him, clutching a flashlight. I stayed in the loft, watching from above. Then, the worst sound yet, a loud crash. It came from the back of the cabin near the small kitchen window. We heard glass shatter, and the cold night air rushed in. Ethan shouted for us to stay put as he ran toward the kitchen. My sister followed, but I stayed frozen in place. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps inside the cabin now, followed by a low, guttural noise that didn't sound human. I finally found the courage to climb down from the loft. When I reached the kitchen, Ethan and my sister were standing there, staring at the broken window. There was no one inside, but the floor was covered in dirt and leaves, and the air smelled like something foul, something rotten. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up and left. A week later, Ethan went back to the cabin to board up the broken window. When he got there, he found more tracks around the property, deep and heavy, leading into the woods near the tree line. He found something else, an old, rusted hunting knife stuck in the ground with dried blood on the blade. We never went back to that cabin. Ethan stopped talking about it altogether, and my sister refused to let him bring it up. I still think about those nights sometimes, wondering who or what was out there in the woods with us. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to come back. I could give you a million examples from my childhood and young adulthood where I felt scared or paranoid while playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost, though not literally, either by myself or with my friends. As kids, we never ventured too far out, but you could occasionally see the progression of us exploring further and further as we got older, leaving behind forts and carvings. This one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We decided to try and find a new place to set up camp. We walked for what felt like miles and miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively unfamiliar to both of us. We got the camp set up and the fire going, planning to wait until nightfall, smoke some weed, and play Monopoly. For context, my friend and my buddy is a smaller, really goofy guy, but comes from a family of foresters and always had a deep understanding of trees and different plants. He had no fear of camping alone. If I spent 10,000 hours in the woods, he probably spent 50,000. As for me, I'm taller and sturdier, and as we got older, I spent more time worrying about women and sports. The woods became a place for small parties. I also never had the guts to camp out alone. In fact, older me wouldn't go far out alone, as I could never shake the feeling of being watched, though it was probably just paranoia, still an uneasy feeling. Anyway, the camp was set, the fire was going but starting to burn lower. As the sun went down, we were both cutting up and having a good time. My friend sat in his little chair, always bringing it with him, now loading up his makeshift bong. I was crouched behind, breaking excess limbs off some of the logs we had gathered for the fire. All of a sudden, a strong breeze cut through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I both stopped immediately what we were doing and looked at each other. The breeze blew just enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness, and neither of us said a word. Across from us, on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. It sounded like someone was running, then slowing to a walk, then running again. Definitely on two legs by the sound of it. They were pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped, with softer crunches on the underbrush. I knew by the sound. It was crouched. I was still crouched, and I knew I was staring right at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and whispered, "Buddy!" And when he did, I felt a surge of fear washing over me, could feel it and hear it in him. I had been so fixated on the footsteps, rationalizing what I heard, that I hadn't even considered being afraid. But this was true fear, raw, helpless fear. After a while, my friend grabbed some leaves and threw them on the fire. For a split second, the leaves covered the fire, and we were in pure darkness. Then the fire sprang to life again. We both grabbed more leaves and brush and piled them on the fire. I added sticks and logs. Neither of us took our eyes off that spot or moved for more than an hour. Finally, the leaves crunched as whatever it was slowly walked off. It had been crouched, watching us without moving for far longer than any animal would. It wasn't until after the footsteps disappeared that I realized the smell had disappeared as well, like a paper mill mixed with spoiled eggs. For the rest of the night, besides whispered remarks, neither of us moved. We didn't go into the tent, and I had a very short, light sleep, resting my head on my hands. My friend never went to sleep at all. In the morning, we silently packed up and walked back home. To this day, we talk about it, and in the 7 or 8 years since it happened, my forester friend hasn't camped out alone there again. I parked my old pickup on the edge of a dirt path, the engine rattling into silence. The cabin was barely visible through the thick trees and overgrown brush. It was isolated, tucked near the back edge of an abandoned graveyard that stretched across a low-sloping hill. I'd heard about this place from a coworker who dared me to spend a weekend there alone. He claimed it was used by hunters in the 1970s, but no one had touched it in decades. The challenge sounded ridiculous, but I couldn't resist proving him wrong. A free cabin, even for a weekend, sounded good. It was late October, and the chill in the air made my breath visible. The trees had lost most of their leaves, their bare branches reaching toward a gray sky like skeletal fingers. I threw my duffel bag over my shoulder and grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat. The path leading to the cabin was narrow and uneven, winding between crooked headstones and patches of dead grass. Some of the graves were so old the names and dates had worn away completely, leaving only rough, moss-covered stones. Others had large, ornate markers cracked and leaning from years of neglect. The cabin came into view as the sun dipped below the horizon. It wasn't much. A single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, weathered to the point where the wood looked more gray than brown. The windows were dirty, streaked with grime and cobwebs. A small porch sagged at the front, with a rusted lantern hanging from a hook by the door. I hesitated for a moment before climbing the creaking steps and pushing the door open. Inside, the air was damp and musty, like wet wood and mildew. The cabin had a single room with a small fireplace, a rickety table, and 2 chairs. A narrow bed with a thin mattress was shoved against the far wall. A shelf held a few mismatched dishes and a tin coffee pot. The walls were lined with old newspapers, yellowed and peeling. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, but there was no electricity. I brought lanterns and a few battery-powered lights, so I wasn't too concerned. I set my bag on the table and got to work. I lit a lantern and set it in the middle of the room, its soft glow barely cutting through the gloom. I gathered some dry firewood from a pile near the fireplace and lit a small fire to warm the space. As the flames crackled, I settled into one of the chairs and looked around. The cabin felt eerily quiet. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every little sound. Creaking wood, the wind outside, the occasional rustle of leaves. I decided to explore the area before it got too dark. With the flashlight in hand, I stepped back outside. The graveyard stretched out in all directions, the uneven rows of headstones casting long shadows in the fading light. I followed the path around the edge of the graveyard, noticing how the graves became older and more weathered the farther I went. At the very back, near the tree line, I found a cluster of graves that looked different from the rest. They were smaller, almost child-sized, and the markers were simple wooden crosses. Many of them rotted and broken. Something about them unsettled me, but I shrugged it off and turned back toward the cabin. The night settled in quickly, the darkness thick and heavy. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, beans and canned stew, then stretched out on the bed. It wasn't comfortable, but I was tired from the drive and the hike, so I didn't care. I fell asleep quickly, the firelight flickering on the walls. I woke up hours later, heart pounding. At first, I didn't know what had startled me. The fire had burned low, and the room was dim. The sound of something tapping against the window caught my attention. I froze, straining to hear it. It was faint, like fingernails against glass. I told myself it was probably a branch in the wind, but when I got up to look, there was nothing outside. No trees close enough to touch the cabin, no animals, nothing. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises, scratches on the walls, creaks on the porch. It was probably just the old cabin settling, but in the dead of night, every sound felt amplified. I finally drifted off just before dawn. The next morning, I decided to check the area around the cabin. I found scratch marks on the wooden walls, deep grooves that didn't look like they were made by an animal. The porch steps had fresh scuff marks, as if someone had been standing there. I shook it off as paranoia. Maybe the wood was just old and brittle, and I hadn't noticed the marks the night before. I spent the day wandering the graveyard, taking photos and jotting notes for my coworker. The isolation was starting to get to me. I kept feeling like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, There was nothing there, just rows of graves and empty woods. That night, the noises started again. This time they were louder. Thumps on the roof, footsteps on the porch. I sat up in bed, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The fire was out, and the cabin was pitch dark. My heart raced as I listened, trying to pinpoint the sounds. Then came the unmistakable creak of the door handle. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The door didn't open, but the handle jiggled again. Harder this time. I grabbed the lantern and lit it quickly, the light flooding the room. The sound stopped. I waited, flashlight in hand, but nothing happened. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the porch was empty. The ground was damp from the evening dew, and there were footprints leading away from the cabin. Footprints. They disappeared into the graveyard. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with a hunting knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, waiting for dawn. When the first light broke over the horizon, I packed my things and left. As I walked back to the truck, I glanced over my shoulder at the cabin one last time. The door was closed, the porch empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me leave. I never told my coworker the full story. I just said the cabin was creepy and left it at that. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear those faint tapping sounds, like fingernails against glass. I don't know if it's just my imagination or something that followed me home. Either way, I don't think I'll ever sleep in a place like that again. Two summers ago, events occurred in the Grand Teton area. My boyfriend at the time, now my husband, let's call him H, was an avid outdoorsman and had also served in the military. I was studying ecology and wanted to spend more time outdoors, so he decided to take me on my first backpacking trip, just the two of us. For those unfamiliar, the Grand Tetons are well known for their wildlife, particularly grizzly bears. My only experience with bears up to that point was seeing a small black bear cross the road from the safety of my car. Seeing grizzly country signs at every turn wasn't helping to ease my nerves. H looked like Indiana Jones with a machete hanging from his belt, large knives attached to each side, and bear spray strapped to his waist. Picture the full gear. The beginning of our 25-mile journey was all uphill. When in bear country, you're supposed to make noise to avoid startling wildlife by accidentally sneaking up on them. As you can imagine, going uphill with a 40-pound pack makes it difficult to hold a conversation. About an hour in, we were almost at the top of the ascent when I noticed that the woods had gone completely silent, except for the rushing stream to our left. Silent woods are never a good sign, usually indicating a predator nearby. At this point, I was in front of my boyfriend, and we were about to crest the hill. For the past 20 minutes, we hadn't said a word to each other, too tired to speak. We both noticed the silence at the same time and exchanged knowing glances. I came over the top of the hill and immediately froze. Sitting not 10 feet in front of me, right in the middle of the trail, was a grizzly bear. My husband wasn't aware yet, as he was still behind me. In my frozen state, I managed to swing my arm wildly behind me, trying to get H's attention. I was too terrified to speak. The bear went from sitting to all fours, never taking its gaze away from us. H quickly moved around me, so I was behind him and began yelling. Being in the military, he knew how to yell. The grizzly wasn't fazed, though. It started walking slowly toward us. I was on the verge of passing out from terror when we heard a loud crack from the woods. The bear heard it too and bolted toward the stream. A second crack boomed again, closer this time. H said, "It's probably just some falling branches," but we both knew that wasn't the case. At this point, we kept walking quickly up the trail, trying to put some distance between us and the grizzly, and those strange noises. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up, and at that moment H stopped in front of me. He turned around to look at me, and I looked behind me. To this day, we're not sure what we saw. Back where we had been standing, there was a large black-brown mass. It looked 3 times bigger than the already large grizzly we had just seen moments before. Its back was facing us, and then it stood up on its hind legs. It looked similar to a bear, but something about the shape was just off. At this point, I was probably stupid to run away, but that's exactly what we did. We were aware of heavy footsteps behind us, but neither of us looked back. The footsteps eventually faded. By now, I was a mess. H did his best to console me. "Honey, this is extremely unusual. Bears usually stay away from humans. We're gonna be okay. I'm sure it won't happen again." That was enough to convince me to continue on the backpacking trip. Not an hour later, though, we reached a clearing where we decided to rest and eat a snack. About a minute after we sat down, I noticed the bushes moving toward us in a straight line. Out of the brush came an adolescent grizzly, who looked just as spooked as we did, but he came straight for us. H, being the crazy nut that he is, decided to charge back at the bear while screaming, "Bear spray at the ready." That did the trick, and the bear ran off. I couldn't believe it, just my luck. But that wasn't even close to what happened the second night. Before we began backpacking, we let the ranger station know which trails and route we'd planned to take. With this information, they usually send a ranger on horseback at some point during the backpacking trip to check on you and make sure everything is okay. There weren't many approved trails left for us to choose from, and it was just our luck that they were the most difficult. Apparently, over the 3 days we were on those trails, we were the sole hikers. We didn't see a single other person once. At one point, we were en route, and we missed the ranger who came to check on us. We'd been following hoof prints the entire second day, and we hadn't seen any the day before. I had some foot problems, so we spent valuable daylight trying to adjust my boots, changing laces, socks, to compensate for the pain. When we started back on the trail, we maybe had an hour or two of daylight left, and in the woods it gets dark fast. I was exhausted, and now it was dark. H was the only one with a working headlamp. His mind wouldn't turn on for some reason. We needed to find somewhere to set up camp. It was freezing and the wind was howling, making a strange sound as it rushed through the trees. It made it difficult to hear H or discern other sounds coming from the woods. After another hour of hiking through the dark, we found a clearing. Well, it was more like a bowl, 200 meters in diameter, with both sides about 10 meters down from the trail to the bottom. The place felt strange, and we both could feel it. Though H didn't tell me how freaked out he was until after we left. There was no moonlight, so all we had was the dim illumination of his headlamp, our small camp stove, and the flashlight I fished out from my pack. Half the trees were dead and fallen just in the bowl. The vegetation elsewhere was very dense. To help ease my anxiousness, H started playing Ninja Sex Party out of his portable speaker. It didn't help much. The music echoed off the trees, creating a dissonance of sounds. He also thought it would ward off any predators nearby, but we soon knew our anxiousness wasn't just paranoia. The silence returned. There hadn't been a single bird chirp since we arrived at the clearing. It may have been the obnoxious music, but because of our previous experience, we decided to turn it off and head into the tent. It was freezing. As soon as we were situated in our sleeping bags, we heard deep cracks and thuds echoing from the trees beyond. Falling trees. There had been a lot of wildfires that season and very little rain. We both froze. That sound wasn't an echo. It came from inside the clearing, not a falling tree. It came from right outside the tent. We both stopped breathing. A's hand found mine and we clung to one another, paralyzed. Something dragged across the outside of our tent, making an indentation as it went along. It was thin, almost like a finger. "What is it?" I whispered, shaking. I don't know. It shouldn't be a person. We're the only ones on this side of the mountain." I was trying my hardest to stifle sobs and listen to what was on the outside. I could hear steps, but couldn't decipher what it was. The steps stopped. Then the entire side of the tent slowly pushed inward. At this point, whatever was outside knew we were inside. I shined my flashlight at the side of the tent. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was the shape of a human face pressed against the tent. I could make out the nose, an open mouth, and each time it breathed, the tent around the mouth billowed in and out. I whispered. He pulled out a Glock from his sleeping bag and cocked it. The sound shattered across the silence. The face pulled back, and we heard fast footsteps heading toward the edge of the clearing. We didn't leave the tent until the sun was shining the next morning. The first thing we noticed was the smell of urine. We came out of the tent and looked around. Whoever it was had peed on our coals, leaving a disgusting stench of evaporated urine. Footprints surrounded our tent, circling it multiple times. Muddy hoof prints decorated the outside. Well, we think they were mud anyway. Wildlife isn't the most dangerous thing in the backcountry. It was the fall of 2018, and I had been looking for a quiet place to clear my head. Work had been overwhelming, and I felt like I was drowning under the weight of deadlines and stress. A cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape, somewhere I could disconnect from everything and finally breathe. I found a rental listing online for a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Michigan, far from any towns or highways. It was described as secluded and peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I packed light. Just enough clothes for a week, some canned food, and a few books to keep me company. The drive out was long, but the further I got from the city, the lighter I felt. The air smelled fresher. The trees lining the winding road seemed endless, and the noise of civilization faded away until all I could hear was the hum of my car and the occasional rustle of leaves. When I finally reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. The cabin was smaller than I had expected, but it had a certain charm. It was made of weathered wood, with a small porch out front and a single rocking chair that creaked in the breeze. There was a fire pit a few yards away and a small shed in the back, though I had no plans to use it. I stepped inside and was immediately struck by how quiet it was. The only sound was the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. The interior was simple. A small living room with a couch and a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom with a bed that looked like it had seen better days. A handwritten note on the counter welcomed me and mentioned that there was no cell service, but the cabin had a landline for emergencies. That didn't bother me. I had come here to unplug anyway. The first 2 days passed without incident. I spent my time reading on the porch, hiking the nearby trails, and cooking simple meals. The solitude was exactly what I needed, and I felt like I was finally starting to unwind. But on the third night, things started to feel off. It began with the noises. At first, I chalked it up to the natural sounds of the forest, branches creaking in the wind, animals rustling in the underbrush. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew stranger. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard what sounded like footsteps on the gravel outside. I froze, my heart racing. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the deliberate pace of the steps didn't sit right with me. The next morning, I found nothing unusual outside. No footprints, no sign of anything that might have caused the noise. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I decided to take a long hike to clear my head. The trail behind the cabin wound deep into the woods, and for the first hour it was peaceful. But then I noticed something strange. A faint smell, like something rotting. It was faint at first, but as I walked, it grew stronger. I searched for the source, half expecting to find a dead animal, but I found nothing. The smell eventually faded, and I tried to push it out of my mind. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew long, the uneasiness returned. I decided to build a fire in the fire pit, hoping the warmth and light would push away the creeping sense of dread. As I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me whip my head around, but I saw nothing. Around midnight, I decided to head inside. As I was putting out the fire, I thought I saw movement in the woods, just a flicker of motion out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, but whatever it was had disappeared. My pulse quickened, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I considered leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild. I had come here to escape stress, not to create new fears, so I stayed. I spent most of the day inside, reading and trying to distract myself. But by nightfall, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I decided to check all the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. As I was closing the curtains in the living room, I caught a glimpse of something outside, a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I didn't dare turn on the lights, afraid of drawing attention to myself. I sat in the dark, clutching a flashlight and waiting. Hours passed, but the figure never approached the cabin. I told myself it could have been a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. Large, unmistakably human footprints. They led from the tree line to the fire pit and then back into the woods. My stomach churned. Whoever it was had been watching me, standing just feet from where I had been sitting the night before. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things in a hurry, throwing them into my car without caring if they were organized. As I was about to leave, I noticed something strange on the porch. A small bundle of sticks tied together with twine. It hadn't been there the night before. My hands shook as I picked it up and examined it. There was nothing overtly threatening about it, but the fact that someone had left it there while I slept filled me with a deep, primal fear. I got in my car and drove away, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Even as I reached the main road and the safety of civilization, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods. But I know one thing for certain: I'll never go back.